what's up? I'm not Jewish, but I am a big fan of Jewish style cooking, and especially lately I've been curious about the Jewish holiday braised brisket. And seeing as most of us don't have a Jewish mom or bubby to make that dish for us, today I'm gonna show you how to make something close to it at home for yourself, including a super comforting Jewish-ish side dish that makes mashed potatoes look kind of lame by comparison. To get started, I'll need some brisket. This one is a whole trimmed version and it is about 8 pounds or 3.5 kilos. Whole brisket just means that there's both muscles attached to it, the leaner flat and the much fattier point. Despite this brisket being pre-trimmed, it still has a pretty excessive fat cap in certain places, so I'm gonna remove some fat where it looks like it's thicker than say 1/2 inch. Also, I prefer to use the whole brisket here as opposed to just the point or just the flat because it cooks more evenly in my experience, and having the fattier point sitting on top of the leaner flat kind of bastes downwards as it cooks. Once I've got some of that extra fat trimmed off, I'm gonna hit each side of this brisket with a quick squeezer of oil. This is gonna help transfer the dry heat of the oven to the surface of the meat, and then I'm gonna season both sides generously with a very large grip of salt, at least 3 tablespoons. Once this meat is well dusted up like this, I'm gonna throw it into a 550F oven to sear it on the outside for 10 to 15 minutes. While that cooks, I'm gonna work up the onions for this braise. So into a hot cast iron pan, I'll add a heavy squeezer of olive oil, then 1 kilo or about 3 to 4 large onions that I've sliced thin. From here, I'm gonna pan roast these onions without salt for 7 to 8 minutes over high heat. No salt here because I don't want any extra moisture being drawn out to steam up the pan. Right now, I'm just trying to get these onions nice and roasty on the outside with just a touch of caramelization. And if you're wondering, hey Bri, why not sear the beef and onions in the roasting pan that you're gonna be braising in later on? Well, my roasting pan is a cheap, shitty one from Target, and the bottom is not thick enough for me to really do any high heat cooking. As you can see, this burned pretty bad, and now all that burnt stuff is mixed in with my onions. Not to mention that the brisket itself also got kind of burned, and it smoked up my house like crazy. And after 10 to 12 minutes over high heat, these onions have taken on some nice brown caramelization, so I'm gonna move them over to my roasting pan to hang out while I wait for the beef. Speaking of beef, this brisket is well seared on the top side. So next I'll take it out of the oven, flip it over, and then load it back into the oven to sear it on the fatty side for another 10 to 15 minutes. And after 25 to 30 minutes, this bris is ready to come out. As you can see, just about every corner of this thing has taken on some nice Maillard browning, way more than we could get just in a pan. Next, I'm gonna move this meat over to my roasting pan on top of my onions. Then I'll add about a cup or so of water onto the pan that I roasted the beef on, and then I'll scrape it with my tongs to release any fondy bits. In that goes. Next, I'm gonna make the cooking liquid. First, I'll combine 2 900-gram boxes of store-bought beef broth. In the comments, a lot of you guys from Europe said that you can't get store-bought stock. Use water, that's totally fine because this stuff that I have isn't that beefy. So to solve for the beefiness here, I'm gonna add in 30 grams of better than bouillon beef base. Behind that, I'll add 30 grams of worch, 10 grams of paprika, 5 grams of garlic powder, 3 grams of black pepper, 1 to 2 grams of dried thyme, 200 grams of canned tomato sauce, 15 grams of anchovies that I've minced into a paste. By the way, this is optional, but it does bring a really nice umami depth that almost replicates fish sauce. Then 200 grams of ketchup and 50 grams of A1 steak sauce. That's right. Don't be ashamed. Ketchup and A1 are like the French mother sauces of mom-style cookery, and at its core, this brisket is a mom-made dish. In fact, both of the Jewish mothers that I consulted for this recipe use a lot of ketchup as their main flavor base, and it makes total sense because it's sweet, it's sour, and has a ton of off-the-shelf flavor. Also, one mom used barbecue sauce and one used A1 in addition to ketchup, and given the choice between the two, B-Boy is always gonna choose A1. Next, I'm gonna spin this to combine with my immersion blender, but of course a whisk would also work. Then I'm going to pour this liquid over the beef, and then I'll drop a piece of parchment paper on top. This is a classic restaurant move that I like to use to keep the heat right on the meat, helping to speed up its cooking, and it helps keep the meat from drying out later on in the process when we'll be cooking without a cover. Now once this is tightly wrapped with foil, it goes into a 300F oven, and I'll check back in 4 hours. 4 hours later, I'm going to check back on this meat to see exactly where it's at. I'm not expecting it to be done per se, but I want to know how much longer I need to wait. And when I stick a fork in this, you can see that the muscle fibers are still pretty tight and not even close to shreddable. So I'm going to guess another 1.5 to 2 hours. This time I'm going to load it back into the oven uncovered to get some browning and reduction happening to the liquid. And like I said, the parchment's on there, so it's not going to dry out. 2 hours later, or after 6 hours in total, I'm going to lift this beef out of the oven so that we can check it one more time. At this point, it is much more tender and just about at the point of being shreddable. We definitely don't want to go too much further than this because we want to be able to slice the beef without it totally falling apart. Now I'm going to let this cool on my counter for 1 hour, and then I'm going to load it into my fridge to fully cool and set up for 12 to 24 hours. The next day, before I finish this brisket, I'm going to make a quick side dish called Kugel, or something that is Kugel adjacent. So to get started, into a large pot of boiling water, I'll add 2 handfuls of salt and then 1 pound of egg noodles. These ones are called dumplings, and they're egg white only egg pasta. That added white gives the noodles a really nice chew that help them keep their texture when we turn them into casserole. This is going to take 9 to 10 minutes in total to cook, so in the meantime, let's make the custard for said casserole. So into a food processor, I'll combine 450 grams of sour cream, 450 grams of cottage cheese. Just like ketchup or A1, cottage cheese is a classic mom ingredient. Then 6 large eggs, 12 grams of salt, 1 to 2 grams of dried thyme, 2 grams of black pepper, and 150 grams of grated Gruyere. This Gruyere is a non-traditional addition as far as I can tell, but for me, this dish needed a little bit more salty, cheesy funk, and Gruyere is the right girl for that job. Once everything's in here, I'll spin it up for 20 to 30 seconds or until the cottage cheese is mostly broken down and the eggs are mixed into everything else. And as you can see, this stuff's pretty loose and doesn't look that good, but the eggs are going to thicken this thing in the oven and the pasta is going to absorb a lot of that liquid. One more non-traditional touch here is to add some buttery aromatics. So into a 12-inch cast iron pan over medium heat, I'm going to add a whole stick of butter and melt it. Then I'll add in 200 grams of thinly sliced onions, 15 grams of minced garlic, a strong pinch of salt, and then I'll jump in and stir to get this thing sweating. I do not want any caramelization going on here. That would make this Kugel taste too dark and heavy. So instead, we're going to be sweating these onions in the butter over low heat to soften them gently. These are going to take about 5 to 8 minutes in total, which happens to be the perfect amount of time to finish cooking that pasta. And very quickly thank Trade Coffee for sponsoring this video. Trade Coffee makes it easy to find new coffee that tastes really good. You just subscribe and they ship it right to your door whenever you want. And oh yeah, the coffee is great. Trade partners with really high quality independent roasters from all over the country. Since I've mostly retired from caffeine over the last year, I've had to adapt to whatever one type of decaf coffee the grocery store has. You know, the one that just tastes like hot brown and nothing else. Luckily, Trade has me covered and has sent me like 4 or 5 absolute banger decafs in a row that are just as fresh, aromatic, fruity, and robust as any third wave fully caffeinated hot shot coffee that I've ever had. Especially this bag that I just got from Metric Coffee in Chicago, which by the way is right where I used to live. With Trade, you can subscribe to a collection of their coffees or choose exactly the ones you want, and you can even let them know how you're going to brew it so that your coffee will come ground specifically for your apparatus. Right now, Trade is offering viewers of this video a total of $30 off a subscription at drinktrade.com/Brian. A Trade subscription makes a great gift, and caffeine or no caffeine, you guys, this coffee tastes very good. Again, that's drinktrade.com/Brian for $30 off. After 6 to 8 minutes of gentle sweating, these onions and garlic are nicely melted and are going to give this Kugel a backbone of savory, buttery sweetness that really helps set it apart from the more bare bones classic. Next, I'll move it over to a bowl to hang out while I check back on my pasta. And over here, it's been about 9 to 10 minutes. And at this point, the noodles are just past al dente, so I'm going to drain off the water and then throw the nudes into the bowl with my onions. Next goes in my sour cream egg custard, and then I'll fold it all together. And it's going to look kind of soupy, you guys, but like I said, the eggs are going to take care of that later on. And once it's nicely combined, I'm going to load this Kugel mixture into a well-buttered 9x13 baking dish, then top it with a very generous dose of buttery panko breadcrumbs. This is just a mixture of 120 grams of coarse panko and then 30 grams of melted butter that I've stirred together. Adding the fat to the crumbs really helps them fry on top as opposed to just bake. Without any fat, they wouldn't get golden and wouldn't get nearly as crispy. Once I've got these crumbs evenly spread over this entire dish, I'm going to load the Kugel into a 375F oven to bake it for 50 to 60 minutes. That's just about how long it's going to take for the egg custard to set throughout and for the breadcrumbs to get fried and golden brown. And 55 minutes later, this Kugel is fully cooked and looking real cool. As you can see, we've got some perfectly brown breadcrumbs that are stuck into a well-set, eggy, cheesy, zippy custard. But this is going to take another 45 minutes to an hour to set enough to serve it. Luckily, that's the perfect amount of time to finish my brisket. Remember that old thing in the fridge from yesterday? Well, now it's fully cooled and all the beef fat has set up on top. I'll use a slotted spoon to remove as much of that fat as is practical. Some beef fat good, a lot bad. Next, I'm going to reach into the pan and snatch out my cooked cooked brisket so that I can finish off the cooking liquid. I'll just set that on a sheet tray here, and I'll let that hang out for a minute while I move this sauce over to the stove and bring it up to a boil over medium-high heat. As is, this sauce tastes pretty good. Like, you could serve it, but it also could be much, much better. So I'm gonna reduce it by at least half, but probably closer to 3 times to concentrate and thicken it. A crutch that I like to use to create some thickness is to add in some bloomed gelatin. That's 4 powder packets that I've added to about 40 to 50 grams of water and just stirred to combine. Gelatin helps replicate the natural gelatin that would be present in high quality stock that's made from scratch with cartilaginous bones. This gelatin is gonna thicken the texture of this sauce, but in a better way than cornstarch or roux would. This sauce is gonna be silky and grippy, but still loose. Now I'm gonna give this another 30 minutes or so to reduce, and in the meantime, I'm gonna slice my brisket. I like to start on the point end, working my way towards the flat, and in total, I'm gonna cut this into 12 to 15 very thick slices that are about 1 inch thick, or maybe slightly thicker. If you go any thinner than that, you're probably gonna miss that shred in your mouth bite that you get from a perfectly braised piece of beef. Texturally though, this beef feels just right. It's tender, but not falling apart, and even cold, it's delicious. I will say though that I've noticed a few of these pieces are a little bit fattier on top than I thought they would be, so I'm gonna trim some of, but not all of that fat off. It's up to you. Back at the stove, my brisket gravy's been reduced by about 60%, and the bubbles have started to get a little bit larger. At this point, I like to come back and taste it to see how the sauce feels in the mouth. It should have a silky thickness to it without being sticky or overly intense. And that tastes good. It's still a touch loose, but has a nice weight to it, and that's gonna stick to the meat perfectly. Now to finish this dish, I'm gonna shingle my brisket slices carefully into the sauce so that I don't shred them apart, and then I'm gonna spoon that sauce over the meat so that I can start warming it through. Oh yeah, I also need to taste this sauce for seasoning, not just viscosity. And yes, this needs a touch more salt to be what I would consider pro-level bad boy. And then I'll just keep covering it with sauce to lube it up and to keep things warm. Lastly, I'm gonna throw this pan covered into either a low oven or on top of a low burner until it's party time. This dish holds hot really well compared to something like beef stroganoff, which gets dry and overheated super quick. Now to plate this up, I'm gonna drop a big square of hot, well-set kugel onto my plate, and then a Flintstone-sized slice of tender, unctuous beef brisket. Then of course, I'm gonna top that with a generous hit of the melted onions and then the perfectly reduced and seasoned ketchup gravy. And oh my sweet secular lord, we've got fatty beef, onion sauce, and what is basically Jewish-inspired baked mac and cheese. Is it authentic? I don't know. That doesn't really matter to me. What matters is that this dish tastes really good and will make anyone who eats it feel loved and comforted and probably sickly full. That's exactly what any mom or grandma wants the most, and I really hope that she or you make this soon. Let's eat this thing.